The following program contains disturbing and distressing descriptions and film of executions, atrocities and the shelling of civilians that may distress some viewers.
Welcome to Four Corners. Several weeks ago, when we showed shocking footage of the way Australian cattle were being slaughtered in Indonesian abattoirs, there was outrage across the country. Live exports to Indonesia were stopped almost immediately. Tonight, this program again has devastating video evidence of awful atrocities, but this time it relates to the brutal slaughter of humans, an estimated 40,000 of them. The deeply confronting footage we're about to show you includes graphic evidence suggesting war crimes committed by Sri Lankan government forces about 2 years ago in the final phase of their long war against the secessionist Tamil Tigers, a vicious civil war lasting more than a quarter of a century. The report also covers atrocities carried out by the Tamil Tigers in those final weeks, including the use of civilians as human shields. Allegedly, they also shot civilians to prevent them leaving the no-fire zones. In April this year, the United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon released an advisory report urging a full investigation into allegations of serious violations of human rights law, some of which it said could amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The official Sri Lankan response is that the report to Ban Ki-moon is based on biased material without any verification, and its conclusions are fundamentally flawed. Tonight's footage would suggest otherwise. A team from Britain's Channel 4, led by veteran journalist John Snow, has completed a forensic investigation into the final weeks of the bitter Sri Lankan conflict. It includes distressing footage captured on mobile phones, showing the summary executions of prisoners, which the Sri Lankan government says has not been verified as authentic. The report also highlights the aftermath of repeated shelling of civilian camps within a designated civilian no-fire zone, including a field hospital. The Sri Lankan government still insists its final assault was conducted with a policy of zero civilian casualties. This damning Channel 4 report on Sri Lanka's killing fields appears to make a mockery of the government's claim.
Sri Lanka is a very beautiful place, and that is the image its government would like you to remember. Its tourism industry is recovering from a quarter of a century of brutal civil war. And in March, it triumphantly played host to the Cricket World Cup quarter-final between England and its own national Sri Lankan team. But this public face hides a very different reality. For more than 25 years, the LTTE, or Tamil Tigers, fought for the creation of an independent state in northern and eastern Sri Lanka. They saw it as the only answer to decades of sometimes violent anti-Tamil discrimination by governments sympathetic to the Sinhalese majority. The Tigers themselves were a brutal army, often conscripting child soldiers and pioneering the use of suicide bombing. But they retained the reluctant support of much of the population, which feared the Sri Lankan army even more. The Tigers also established something that looked very much like a functioning military state, with an administrative capital, Kilinochchi, and its own banks, schools, police, and even a television station, with a star presenter known as Isepriya. But in 2008, it all began to change. Government forces, seen here on their victory parade, began a massive offensive designed to crush the Tigers once and for all. As Sri Lanka's increasingly repressive President Mahinda Rajapaksa made clear, this was to be a war to the bloody end. By September 2008, government forces were threatening the Tigers' capital, Kilinochchi. For the 8 or 9 international UN workers left in the town, life was becoming dangerous.
There were a number of air raids pretty much every day and quite often at night time.
As the pressure mounted, the Sri Lankan government told the United Nations they could no longer guarantee their safety. They must leave Kilinochchi and the tiger-held areas. The UN's official spokesman in Sri Lanka at the time was Gordon Weiss. He believes the government's real motive was not the safety of UN personnel.
The government regarded the UN as impediments to their conquest of the Tamil Tigers. By removing those organisations, there were no longer international witnesses to what was coming.
That's a very serious charge, in fact, because what you're saying is that if they didn't want witnesses there, clearly they were going to do things which they could not afford witnesses to see. There was an intention to do those things.
I think they intended to remove independent witnesses to what was coming.
News that the UN's international staff were leaving spread quickly, and crowds of frightened Tamil civilians besieged the UN base.
They were really pleading with us as the UN, as the international community, please don't leave. I just remember it was a very vivid image of these tens of hands coming through the gate and pleading with us not to go. So I ran my camera along the line of people, and there was one girl at the end who, her face was, she wasn't shouting and she wasn't chanting, she was just still, but she had just real sadness in her face. I mean, I was quite emotional at that point as well, and her face just really captured this, have compassion, you know, stay and watch.
ஆகவே தயவு செய்து இவர்களை இங்கே இந்த துன்பங்களை தீர்க்கிறதுக்கு மிகவும் பணிவாக நாங்கள் கேட்டுக்கொள்கிறோம்.
Those pleas fell on deaf ears at the UN.
Our official response was that we accepted the government's suggestion that they could no longer guarantee our safety.
What did you personally think?
I personally thought that it was a mistake.
For me, that was personally the worst moment of my life. It seemed like it was their greatest hour of need, where you had an army sitting on the doorstep wanting to take the town, and we drove out. That was a very, very difficult experience for us. And a real sense of abandonment of these people.
As the UN report now acknowledges, the removal of their staff left virtually no international witnesses in the area, which meant the path was open for government forces to launch a final offensive into the tiger-held areas. In January 2009, the Tigers' stronghold of Kilinochchi fell.
As the front lines closed in on the Tamil Tigers, more and more civilians were caught up directly in the line of fire. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people were on the move. They were fleeing.
These were civilians, driven from their homes by government forces who appeared to see all Tamil civilians as virtually indistinguishable from the fighters of the Tamil Tigers. But the Tigers too showed little respect for civilians, increasingly prepared to use them as pawns or human shields in this battle to the end. Over the next 4 months, these hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians would be bombed, herded and corralled into an ever-decreasing area of land. In these killing fields, tens of thousands of them were destined to die, targeted by deliberate government fire.
Combatants in a conflict have a duty not to target civilians. They're only allowed to target military objectives, and when they go outside what's purely military, justified by military necessity, then they're already in the range of illegality.
And that is exactly what happened. As the frightened Tamil civilians fled, government forces followed. And more civilians like these fell victim to the government's relentless offensive. This was an unequal war. The Sri Lankan government had the tacit support of most of the world's powers and was equipped with heavy artillery from China and elsewhere. It also had a fleet of Israeli Kafir combat aircraft. This footage of a typical raid comes from the government. But on the ground, the Tamils were filming too. We don't know who shot this. It may have been a Tiger cameraman, or it may have been a civilian. Whoever it was, they clearly thought it important to keep a record. Families dug shallow trenches which provided limited protection. But nothing could protect their children against the fear.
Every time when the front line moves closer, the shell bombs hit nearby you and you can hear the bullets, sort of the fighting, the gun sounds and everything. Then people will realize, well, that's it, they're close enough, that now is the time for us to move.
Vani Kumar was a young English Tamil woman who had left London to spend 6 months with relatives in Sri Lanka. But then she found herself caught up with tens of thousands of displaced Tamil civilians on the exodus eastward. They had nowhere to go. They just knew they had to leave. Then, some 3 weeks after the fall of Kilinochchi, the Sri Lankan government announced the creation of what they called a no-fire zone. This, they claimed, was part of an official government policy of 0 civilian casualties. Among the thousands who flocked here, encouraged by that promise, were doctors, nurses, patients whose hospitals had been destroyed in the fighting. Just inside the no-fire zone, they set up this emergency hospital. A makeshift arrangement of beds and mattresses in an abandoned primary school. It was clearly marked, with red crosses on the roof, which gave it protection under international law.
It's quite simple. You can't attack a hospital. The only exception would be if there was some evidence that the hospital was actually being used for military purposes. Otherwise, it's very clear a hospital is totally off limits. It's not a military objective. How could it be attacked?
But government forces did attack it. One man who arrived immediately afterwards found a scene of horror. We have disguised